Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. I want to try and keep this one short and sweet and try my hand at making a brief video that just focuses on one quick point. So anyway, let me get to the point. Um, I just saw this article yesterday that really kind of made my point about Bernie Sanders' shortcomings regarding foreign policy that I've made in previous videos. So I just want to talk about this a bit. So basically what happened was that the New York Times sent out a survey to all the presidential candidates about foreign policy, except for, can you guess who they didn't send a survey about foreign policy to? Bingo, Tulsi Gabbard. But anyway, let's talk about how Bernie answered these questions and why it's really problematic and really makes my point about how he isn't someone we can trust on foreign policy, and his record over the past 30 years that he's been in Washington has been very checkered. So I say that he's lately been emphasizing his anti-war rhetoric. I say Bernie Sanders has won the popular vote in both the New Hampshire and Iowa presidential primary contests in considerable part by presenting himself as an opponent of war. They say he was the most vocal of the Democratic presidential aspirants in criticizing Donald Trump's assassination of General Soleimani of Iran, but we know that's not the case. Tulsi has actually been as or more vocal about it. But anyway, they say his poll numbers have risen in tandem with his stepped-up anti-war rhetoric. He's repeatedly stressed his vote against the invasion of Iraq in 2003, claiming that he not only voted against it, but helped lead the effort against it. But when speaking to the foremost newspaper of the American ruling class, i.e. the New York Times, the Sanders campaign, it's hard to say if he's answering this himself, but the Sanders campaign adopts a very different tone than that employed by the candidate when addressing the public in campaign stump speeches or TV interviews. So he answered, or his campaign answered, a foreign policy survey of the Democratic presidential candidates, except for Tulsi, published by the Times the other day. And it says Sanders' campaign is at pains to reassure the military intelligence establishment and the financial elite of the senator's loyalty to U.S. imperialism and his readiness to deploy its military machine. Perhaps most significant and chilling is the response to the third question in the Times survey. They asked him, would you consider military force to preempt an Iranian or North Korean nuclear or missile test? So, totally unprovoked attack is what they're asking about. Would you consider a totally unprovoked attack against Iran or North Korea if they merely tested a nuclear device or a missile? And his campaign gave a one-word answer, yes. So Sanders' White House, according to his campaign, would be open to launching a military strike against Iran or North Korea, which already has nuclear arms, as well as obviously both countries already have missiles, to prevent, not respond to, but prevent not even a threatened missile or nuclear strike against the United States, but a mere weapons test. This is a breathtaking, reckless position, no less incendiary than those advanced by the Trump administration. So he's saying, or his campaign is saying, he's willing to risk a war in order to block weapons tests by countries that are, on the U.S.'s official enemies list, countries that have been subjected to horrific economic sanctions by the U.S. as well as military provocations for a very long time now. Moreover, his response makes clear that he fully subscribes to the doctrine of preemptive war declared to be official U.S. policy in 2002 by George W. Bush. An illegal assertion of aggressive war as an instrument of foreign policy, the Bush doctrine violates the principles laid down at the Nuremberg trials of Nazi officials after World War II, violates the UN Charter, and other international bodies of international law. It's well, it doesn't get worse, but it is just as bad elsewhere in the survey. Would you consider military force for a quote-unquote humanitarian intervention? Answer, yes. No elaboration, just yes. Among the wars carried out by the United States in the name of humanitarianism or defending human rights are the war in Bosnia and bombing of Serbia in the 1990s, which Bernie supported, the 2011 war in Libya that ended in the lynching of Gaddafi and killing him, and the civil war in Syria, which was fomented by Washington and conducted by its al-Qaeda-linked proxy militias, as well as, of course, brutal economic sanctions and U.S. troops in the area and currently occupying Syrian oil fields. They here is the World Socialist website, a publication of the Socialist Equality Party, which I have my political disagreements with, but they do a lot of good reporting. Anyway, they say the fraudulent humanitarian pretexts for U.S. aggression were no more legitimate than the lie of weapons of mass destruction used in the neo-colonial invasion of Iraq. The result of these war crimes, the ones based on the pretext of humanitarian intervention, which Bernie Sanders supports, the result of these war crimes has been the destruction of entire societies, the death of millions, and dislocation of tens of millions of more people. Because, I mean, who could forget that Madeleine Albright in sometime in the 1990s was asked, what about all the horrible suffering in Iraq that's going on because of the economic sanctions? Do you think that that's worth what you're doing? And she said, we think the price is worth it. Well, guess what? So does Bernie Sanders, because he supported those horrible sanctions, as well as many other war crimes. In response to a question from the Times on the assassination of Soleimani, which this is one of the occasions where I disagree with the WSWS here. The Sanders campaign calls Trump's action illegal, but refuses to take a principled stand against targeted assassinations in general and associates itself with the attacks on Soleimani as a terrorist. Well, I agree with that, but what I disagree with is what they earlier said, that he's been the most vocal critic of the assassination of Soleimani. Well, you can see down here he's waffling in his criticism. Specifically, his campaign reply states that clearly there is evidence that Soleimani was involved in acts of terror. He also supported attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq, i.e. when the U.S. was illegally occupying Iraq, and Iraqis wanted the U.S. to leave. Okay, they go on to say, but the right question isn't, was this a bad guy, but rather, does assassinating make Americans safer? The answer is clearly no. In other words, the extrajudicial killing of people, the WS says, by the U.S. government is justified if it makes Americans, quote, safer. This is a tacit endorsement of the policy of drone assassinations that came into its own under the Obama administration. Elsewhere, he says, when asked, would you agree to begin withdrawing American troops from Korea? The response, no, not immediately. So Sanders is supporting the continued presence of tens of thousands of U.S. troops in Korea. On Israel, Sanders calls for a continuation of the current level of U.S. military and civilian aid and opposes the immediate return of the U.S. Embassy from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, even though he supports it eventually being returned. And his views on Russia are, we've talked about this before, just totally neo-McCarthyist. If Russia continues on its current course in Ukraine and other former Soviet states, the New York Times asks, should the United States regard it as an adversary or even enemy? And the answer again, yes. Question, should Russia be required to return Crimea to Ukraine before it is allowed back into the G7? Answer, yes. They summarize it by pointing out that, as Tulsi has pointed out on many occasions, and obviously those of us on the independent left have pointed out many times, foreign policy and domestic policy are connected. If you're engaging in an imperialist foreign policy that's soaking up trillions of dollars over the years, that's going to make it impossible to enact the social reforms that Bernie Sanders advocates, and other progressive politicians like Tulsi or what's his name, and the Green Party, Howie Hawkins, advocate. You're not going to have money for that if you're spending all that money on war. And they say, no matter how much Sanders blusters about inequality, it's impossible to oppose the depredations of the ruling class at home while supporting its plunder and oppression abroad. Even if you only partially support it, and you make a huge deal out of, gee, I led the opposition against the Iraq War, which, he was one of the people who did, but he wasn't the leader. But anyway, he supported those policies often enough that, he can't really be said to be someone who's seeing the connection between foreign and domestic policy. And he really does, this whole logic that you think it's okay to engage in a completely unprovoked attack against a sovereign nation merely because they're conducting a missile test or a bomb test or whatever, or that you support quote-unquote humanitarian intervention, this imperialist logic, this American exceptionalism that says, hey, it's okay for us adults to have nuclear weapons and missiles and the world's largest military and so forth, and constantly interfering in the affairs of other countries. But don't you little nations ever dare, you little usually brown nations ever dare to test a nuclear weapon or test a ICBM or something like that, or we're gonna come down on you, or at least we'll threaten you. It's at the very least, it's a xenophobic, bigoted mentality. And sure, the same logic is applied to lily white, mostly Christian nations like Russia, as well as maybe not nations full of maybe not dark skin, but definitely otherized in terms of religion, countries like Iran. This is the bigoted logic of U.S. imperialism, and unfortunately Bernie Sanders buys into it completely. So let's try and make clear the connection between foreign and domestic policy, and let's not get all rosy about Bernie's domestic policies and think that he's some kind of savior when he just fucking doesn't get it about foreign policy. Okay, that's all I have to say today. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Bitter Pill. Like and subscribe below the video. Thanks a lot.